All right, let's get right into it. Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a really fascinating and honestly a highly debated piece of history. We're looking at the origins of Representative Ilhan Omar's family and their historical ties to the collapse of Somalia's Siad Barre regime. Now, we aren't here to take sides. We're simply going to map out the specific historical claims and allegations from our source material so we can understand exactly what's being argued out there. It's like putting together a giant puzzle. So let's start looking at the pieces.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our chronological roadmap for today. First up, we'll look at the Omar family origins. Second, we're going inside the Barre regime. Third, we'll cover the 1991 regime collapse. And finally, we'll examine the asylum claims and allegations.
Section 1. The Omar family origins.
So, to really understand the root of the present-day controversy, we actually have to travel back to the early 80s. Ilhan Omar was born on October 4, 1982, right in the heart of Mogadishu, Somalia. Our source really hones in on her specific family heritage here. You see, her mother was ethnic Banatari. Now, if you aren't familiar, the Banatari were a historically wealthy, cosmopolitan, and very prosperous merchant class. Sadly, her mother passed away around 1984, which meant Ilhan was raised by her father, her grandfather, and her extended family. But, and this is crucial, it's the professional lives of those two men, her father and her grandfather, that the source really focuses on.
And this brilliantly illustrates why this background is so intensely scrutinized. According to the source, the family wasn't just, living in Somalia, they were deeply embedded in its state apparatus. Her father, Nur Omar Muhammad, is described specifically as a Soviet-trained colonel in the Somali National Army. Meanwhile, her grandfather actually served as the director of National Marine Transport. So we're not just talking about one guy with a complicated past, we are looking at two generations holding senior appointments within a very specific, powerful government structure.
Section 2. Inside the Barre regime.
To fully grasp the weight of those government appointments, we really need to look at the dictator they served, Siad Barre. This guy seized power back in October 1969 and ruled with an absolute iron fist for over 2 decades. The 1980s saw aggressive, ruthless power consolidation, which escalated into severe violence and the genocide. Backed initially by the Soviet Union, which, by the way, directly explains that Soviet military training we just mentioned for her father, his rule lasted until the state's completely violent collapse in January 1991.
Ideologically speaking, Barre ran the country under a system he called scientific socialism. The source defines this as a highly specific, kind of unusual fusion of Marxism and Quranic interpretation. And listen, this wasn't just a catchy political slogan, it was the absolute guiding ideology that shaped every state policy and the societal structure that Barre violently enforced.
Well, the human cost of enforcing that regime was just staggering. 50,000 to 200,000. Just let that sink in for a second. That is the estimated death toll from the genocide during the 1980s. The source details how this horrifying figure was achieved through brutal campaigns. We're talking mass killings, aerial bombardment, and forced displacement that explicitly targeted civilians.
To put all that into perspective, the UN Development Program later concluded that Barre's regime had one of the worst human rights records in all of Africa. And here is exactly why this matters for the modern-day allegations. During these years of extreme, systemic violence, critics point out that Ilhan Omar's father was allegedly a ranking colonel. Diaspora researchers emphasize that a colonel is definitely not a peripheral figure, right? They're operating at the mid to high level of a militarily active regime that is actively carrying out these horrific acts.
Section 3. The 1991 regime collapse.
So this extremely volatile situation finally tipped over in January 1991. When the civil war erupted and the regime totally fell apart, the Omar family faced immediate, unavoidable threats from 2 completely different directions. First, their Banatari heritage. As rival clans suddenly filled the power vacuum, the Banatari were heavily targeted just for their historical wealth. Second, their regime ties. Former Barre regime officers were now marked men, actively hunted by the new militias taking over. Escaping wasn't just a choice they made, it was literally survival.
Section 4. Asylum claims and allegations. This brings us to the most fiercely debated part of the source material, the family's 1995 U.S. asylum application. Now, what's really interesting about this contrast is the stark divergence between the two narratives. Publicly, when Nur Omar Muhammad applied for asylum, he presented himself as a civilian educator or teacher trainer, and actually that's exactly how his daughter described him in her memoir. But the alleged reality presented by critics is entirely different. They claim he was actually a highly decorated Soviet-trained military colonel who served a genocidal regime. The critics' entire argument basically hinges on this one fundamental distinction. They allege that her father deliberately omitted his military history. Their specific claim is that he was fleeing consequence, not oppression. In other words, they argue he wasn't your typical refugee fleeing persecution by the Barre regime because he was an active part of the Barre regime. To them, he was a toppled operative escaping retribution from the very people his own government had suppressed.
So, naturally, you're probably wondering, how do we verify these conflicting accounts? Well, the source points out a major hurdle. Nur Omar Muhammad tragically passed away from COVID-19 in 2020. As critics note, whatever falsehoods may have existed regarding what he told immigration authorities likely died with him, unless those records get unsealed. And to date, his 1995 asylum application remains a completely sealed Department of Homeland Security record. No federal agency has formally examined these claims.
Which leaves us with a profound, lingering question. What actually remains hidden in those sealed DHS records? We are left looking at a massive historical discrepancy here. On one hand, you have a public narrative of a civilian family fleeing war. On the other, serious allegations of high-ranking military involvement in a brutal dictatorship. Understanding this history is absolutely crucial when evaluating the backgrounds of our political figures. But until those records are unsealed, if they ever even are, the full truth remains locked away. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep digging into the sources, and I'll catch you next time.